Kia ora, good morning everyone, Rajvan here, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at the very special lens from TTArtisan. I have reviewed quite a few different TTArtisan lenses on this channel, but they are all completely mechanical and also manual focus lenses. So I was quite surprised when they contacted me a few weeks ago and asked if I want to review their first ever autofocus lens. I was even more surprised when I heard this 32mm f2.8 lens is available for 5 different camera mounts: Sony E, Nikon Z, Canon EOS M, RF and also Fuji X. I'm quite surprised because usually when a third-party lens manufacturer is releasing their first autofocus lens, quite often they would just pick one lens mount and release it for that lens mount only. Later on, they may then release it for other lens mount, and the reason is simple: it is just not easy at all to create an autofocus lens. It takes a lot of resources to do that, or otherwise we would have seen the Nikon Z or the Canon RF mount autofocus lenses from Sigma or Tamron already. But TTArtisan is releasing their first ever autofocus lenses on 5 different mounts, so this is really exciting and also a bit worrying. The review sample that I received from TTArtisan is for the Nikon Z mount, but all the different versions, they share the same optics design, so image quality wise they should be pretty much identical. My review usually starts with the design and build quality first, but with this TTArtisan lens, I think most of you would be most interested in its autofocus performance and also if the electronic part of this lens works or not. So let's start and talk about these things first. TTArtisan hasn't gave me much information about the autofocus motor on this lens, and because the sample I received is just a early pre-production sample, so it doesn't have a box or any packaging, so I don't know what sort of autofocus motor they put into the lens. No matter what, the autofocus works pretty well overall. It is not the most quiet autofocus lens. I can hear a bit of autofocus noise, but I won't say it is loud. The autofocus noise is similar to some of my Nikon f-mount AFS lenses. Like, you can hear it especially if you are shooting in a very quiet indoor place, but if you are standing 1 or 2 meters away, then you probably wouldn't hear any autofocus noise. Autofocus speed is acceptable, since it's very unlikely you'll be using this lens to shoot sports or fast action. So for normal everyday photos, I think the autofocus speed is okay. Face detection, eye detection works fine just like a native lens, and I have no problem at all with the autofocus accuracy or reliability as well. I've shot almost 1000 photos with this lens so far. I think only less than 10 photos were not focused correctly, so that's not bad at all. When I use it with my Nikon Z6, I can customize the manual focus ring to control other settings like exposure compensation from the camera's menu, just like a normal Nikon lens. The photo I captured has all the lens information in the metadata. I can see the name of the lens, focal length, aperture settings, etc. So this is good. The aperture is a bit noisy when you are changing the setting. You could also hear the aperture noise when you turn on or turn off the camera. I would say the aperture noise is a bit louder than the autofocus noise. The only thing that does not work is the IBIS, which is a bit of a shame, but to be honest, it is not that big a deal for a 32mm focal length lens. Okay, now let's have a look at the design and build quality of this TTArtisan lens. This TTArtisan 32mm f2.8 lens is quite a compact lens. Not really a pancake lens, but it is one of the smaller full frame lens. For example, if I compare it with the Videochar's 35mm f1.8 lens, this TTArtisan is about half the height. Now, of course, to be fair, the Videochar's is a bit more than one stop faster than this TTArtisan lens. This lens is mostly made of metal, including the rear lens mount that is also metal. There are a few parts that is made of plastic. For example, there's a little cover here at the rear of the lens that is made of plastic, and also the lens hood is also made of plastic. But the main part of the lens is all metal, and it feels very solid and very nice quality. Yes, the lens has a lens hood and it is a built-in one. You can extend it by just pushing it forward. The lens hood doesn't feel too loose or too tight when you want to extend it or pull it back. I really like the lens hood design and it looks quite cool as well. However, I would really prefer if the lens hood is also made of metal, as right now it feels slightly flimsy because of that. There's no filter thread on the lens hood, and also the lens hood is not removable, but you can attach a filter onto the lens directly and it takes 27mm filters. The only control you have on this lens is the focus ring, and it feels very well dampened. And as I've mentioned before, if you use it on a Nikon Z body, you can customize the focus ring to control other settings. I imagine you can do the same thing on some other mounts as well. There's a USB port on the lens mount here for firmware update. It's great to see there's a USB port here, and hopefully TTArtisan will follow up with actual firmware updates to address any issues that user may find in the future. But one thing I'm a bit disappointed though is that it is a micro USB port. I really think USB-C port should be the standard these days. The minimum focus distance of this TTArtisan lens is 0.5 meter, and I do not know what is the maximum magnification ratio. But if you have a look at this photo that was shot at the minimum focus distance, my Lego Stormtrooper definitely looks pretty small, and the maximum magnification would be lower than 0.1 time, which is probably the smallest maximum magnification ratio that I have tested for quite a while. Okay, now let's have a look at the image sharpness, and let's start with the center sharpness first. The center of the lens is reasonably sharp at f2.8. Once we stop down the lens to f4, then the center becomes very sharp. Corner at f2.8 is quite soft. Stopping down the lens to f4 would improve corner sharpness quite a bit, and at f5.6 the corner sharpness becomes very good. While this is not a really fast lens, you could still dissolve the background a bit when shooting close-up photos. The bokeh from this lens looks reasonably nice. Bokeh balls do not look too nervous, and there's only a small amount of highlight at the edge of the bokeh balls. I see a bit of onion pattern in some photos, but overall I think bokeh looks quite alright even if I stop down a bit to f4. At f2.8 I can see quite a bit of light fall off near the corner of the photo. When stopped down to f4, it improved a lot. At f5.6, there's only very small amount of vignetting, which is not really noticeable when you are shooting real-world photos. In terms of chromatic aberration, while I do see a bit of color fringing in some very high contrast area, the amount of color fringing is minor and usually not really noticeable until I zoom in and start pixel peeping. So chromatic aberration control is not bad at all with this TTArtisan 32mm f2.8 lens. When I check my real world photos and also my brick wall test photo, I can see a bit of barrel distortion with this TTArtisan lens, but it is not very serious. Applying a +7 distortion correction in Lightroom would largely remove the distortion. Like a lot of budget lenses, this TTArtisan 32mm f2.8 lens also has pretty average lens flare performance. Lens flare can be quite noticeable when there is a strong light source in front of the camera. The contrast could drop quite a bit and that would give the photo a slightly vintage hazy look. When there is a strong light source that is just outside the frame, it could also cause a bit of lens flare and ghosting too. Fortunately, if you extend the built-in lens hood, it quite often could help minimize the lens flare. Stopping down the lens a bit would also help minimize the lens flare. Sometimes even just stop down the lens from f2.8 to f3.2 could already make some pretty noticeable improvement. With the 7 aperture braid design, this TTArtisan 32mm lens can render 14-point Sunstars, but you have to stop down the lens to at least f11, then you can start to see some Sunstars. But even at the minimum aperture f16, the Sunstars still are not really that sharp at all. When shooting at the maximum aperture f2.8, there is a bit of Coma at the corner of the photo. It is not terrible at all, and I think it's actually quite acceptable. But stopping down the lens to f4 could reduce Coma quite a bit. If you want to use this lens to do some video filming, continuous autofocus works surprisingly well when I test it with my Nikon Z6. I shot this sample video using face tracking and the result is very good. Tracking is fast, reliable, and also focus transition is pretty smooth. I mentioned before that autofocus is not super quiet, but is this a problem when you are filming video? My answer is probably not, but it also depends on where you do your video filming. First, I will show you a quick video that I shot in this room. So really quiet room and the audio was captured using the camera's built-in microphone. So you can hear a tiny bit of autofocus noise, but it's really minor consider how quiet my room is. Now let's check out this video footage from my autofocus test that I did in my garden. Audio was also just recorded using the camera's built-in microphone. I can only hear the wind noise, background noise, and my footstep. I cannot hear any autofocus noise at all. So yeah, I would say autofocus noise is really not a problem unless you are filming in a completely quiet environment and the audio that you want to capture is also super quiet. As mentioned earlier, the aperture noise with this TTArtisan lens is louder than the autofocus noise. So if you are just using the built-in microphone to capture video, I would suggest you keep the aperture value the same during filming, especially if you are filming in a very quiet place. In terms of focus briefing, let's have a look at this test footage when the focus is changed from 0.5 meter to 20 meter and then back to 0.5 meter. Look at the brick wall on the left side and you can see there is quite a bit of focus briefing. But this is pretty much changing the focus from minimum focus distance to infinity focus. So for normal focus transition that doesn't go from one extreme to the other extreme, focus briefing won't be quite as noticeable. Okay, this is my review of the first autofocus lens from TTArtisan. So what is my verdict? I say it met all my expectations. I will even say it exceeded some of my expectation. But then what is my expectation? I have reviewed a number of lenses from TTArtisan, so I know optically or image quality wise what I can expect. But what I really wasn't sure is the autofocus performance and the electronic side of this lens. I wasn't really expecting it would be as good or perfect as the native first-party autofocus lens, but I certainly hope it won't feel like a prototype or experimental product that has lots of issues. So I was expecting it to be somewhere in between, so it works, but it may have a few issues. And turns out this TTArtisan lens is better than that. While there are things that I think it could improve, the autofocus can be a little bit faster and also a little bit more quiet. I want the aperture to be more quiet, but at least autofocus is reliable. My camera didn't have any weird behavior, it didn't lock up, everything was fine over the last 2 weeks when I was testing with this TTArtisan lens. So this is actually a big achievement for the first ever autofocus lens from such a young company. And remember, they are making it for 5 different mounts as well, so not just one camera mount. And one very important thing that we need to consider is the price. If it is a $300 or $400 lens, I would criticize the flaws like the lens flare or the aperture noise a lot harder. With the price that is not even $150, it is really quite hard to complain about anything. The price is just a little bit more expensive than the average budget manual focus Chinese lens, but you get an autofocus lens with full electronics support. So I'm definitely looking forward to see the next autofocus lens from TTArtisan.